The courtroom's heavy oak doors groaned, open as 5-year-old Noah Carter stepped. Inside, his tiny figure dwarfed by the solemn architecture and the sea of adults already seated in his right hand. He held tightly to the leash of a large German shepherd whose deep scar trailed, like a lightning bolt down his right. Flanked the room thick with tension fell into an unnatural hush. Every gaze turned toward the child, but it was a dog regal and alert who drew the most attention. Judge Mark Sullivan, graying at the temples and with eyes as sharp as the gavel he wielded, leaned forward from the bench, the weight of the trial, perhaps the most important he'd presided over in recent memory, rested heavily on the shoulders of the silent little boy and the canine companion. Tethered to him across the courtroom, Richard Hale sat quietly, his hands folded neatly before him, with a neutral, forgettable face and the calm demeanor of a man who believed he had outsmarted the system. Hale had been accused of attempting to abduct Noah just weeks earlier, yet without any physical evidence and with the only eyewitness refusing to speak. Since the incident, the defense had skillfully cast doubt on the credibility of the case. Noah was led to the witness stand, his feet swinging above the floor as he climbed onto the high wooden chair. The leash trembled in his grip, but he never loosened it. Rex, the scarred German shepherd, positioned himself at the base of the stand, sitting upright, muscles taut beneath his weathered coat. Judge Sullivan studied the boy, noting the stiff posture, the way his eyes darted, but never settled than a movement, small, subtle, almost imperceptible. Noah's fingers made a quick gesture, a sign barely noticeable to anyone untrained. It was a cue, one carefully taught in weeks of trauma therapy, but it wasn't lost on the two who mattered most, Rex and the judge. Rex's body changed in an instant. His ears snapped forward, his back straightened, and a low primal growl emerged from deep within his chest. It wasn't a bark, it wasn't for show, it was recognition. His eyes locked onto Hale, and in that moment the courtroom seemed to freeze. A rustle moved through the gallery, whispers rose and fell like the hush of wind over dry grass. Even the prosecutor, Jenna Collins, straightened in her chair. She looked at the judge, her mouth parted in silent realization something had shifted. Sullivan's gavel cracked against the wood. The sharp sound silenced the murmurs. This court is in recess for 15 minutes, he announced, not waiting for objections as people began to file out. Sullivan remained in place, eyes narrowed at the defendant, then back to the child. Something deeper than legal protocol stirred in him. He had seen many witnesses, many outbursts, but never this. Never the quiet urgency of a child who couldn't speak, answered by a dog who couldn't, lie outside the courtroom in a corridor filled with polished floors and echoing footsteps. Noah sat on a bench beside his mother, Sarah Carter. She had aged years and weeks, her face pale from sleepless nights and her arms constantly wrapped protectively around her son. Rex sat pressed against Noah's side, his head resting lightly on the boy's knee. Noah leaned into the contact, his fingers burrowed into the dog's thick fur like it was the only steady thing left in a world of uncertainty. Detective Jack Monroe stood a short distance away, arms crossed, observing, a 25-year veteran of the FBI. Monroe had seen too many children broken by the world, too many cases dismissed on technicalities, but the moment he saw Rex react in that courtroom, his instincts screamed that this case was different. He walked over to Judge Sullivan, who had just stepped into the hallway, and leaned in. That dog recognized him. Monroe murmured, "It wasn't training, it was memory you saw." That Sullivan nodded slowly, eyes still on the boy. "The question is from where?" Meanwhile, in the defense's private chambers, Richard Hale sat motionless. His lawyer, Michael Graves, paced beside him, oblivious to the shift in his client's demeanor. Hale's usually composed expression was now tight with suppressed panic. His fingers clenched a chair, his breath short and shallow. "She brought the dog," Hale muttered. "Why would she bring the damn dog, Graves?" paused, turning to him. What's the problem? You said you'd never seen the kid before. Hale didn't answer. His mind was a wheel, turning too fast, images flashing through. Memory like lightning through clouds. That dog, that scar. Back in the hallway, Jenna Collins spoke. In hushed tones with Monroe and the child advocate, Noah, still silent, reached. For his sketch pad, he drew quickly, almost compulsively. When he finished, he turned. Around it was a picture, crude but clear. A man standing beside a van, a little boy, and the outline of a dog, teeth bared. Standing between them, Monroe stared at it, his chest tightening. He turned to the advocate. I need to check something. Pull. Old K-9 deployment logs especially. Retired service dogs assigned to abduction. Cases Rex silent, but alert rested his head again. Noah exhaled softly. He didn't need to speak. He already had a voice, one with fur fangs and a memory that didn't forget, and the truth was just beginning to surface long before the courtroom, before the silence and the spotlight. Noah Carter had been just another little boy in Elkridge, a 5-year-old with boundless energy, a cheeky grin, and a curiosity that sometimes led to scraped knees and scoldings softened by laughter. He lived with his mother, Sarah, in a modest house tucked between pine trees and frozen sidewalks, a place where hot cocoa was a winter ritual and bedtime stories ended with silly voices and soft good night kisses. Sarah Carter was a single mom, but she made up for what they lacked in luxury with warmth and fierce devotion. She worked at the town library and often brought home worn books for Noah, books about explorers in space and dogs that talked. On the morning it happened, she had only stepped inside to answer the landline, an old rotary phone that rarely rang except for work or her sister in Duff. It was enough, just long enough for her to lose sight of her boy. When she returned to the porch, her breath caught the front gate. Usually latch was wide open. Noah's toy truck sat abandoned on the steps. She sprinted toward the street, calling his name, heart pounding like it might split her chest open, and there he was, frozen on the sidewalk a few feet away from a dark grave, and idling by the curb. A man in a parka stood near him, crouched to eye level, saying something Sarah couldn't hear. She screamed. The man turned. He froze for a heartbeat, then bolted, leaping into the van that peeled away with a screech. She caught the first part of the license plate, Wyke said, before it disappeared into the icy haze. Noah didn't speak, not that day, not the next, not for weeks. The doctors called it selective mutism, brought on by trauma. Sarah called it a nightmare. Noah wouldn't eat unless Cokes, barely slept, and flinched at the sound of any engine, especially vans. When they walked past strangers, he clung to her so tightly she felt the bruises. Hours later, the therapist they were referred to specialize in trauma in young children. He was gentle, kind, and after a few weeks made a recommendation that caught Sarah off guard. What Noah needs isn't just talk therapy, he explained. He needs connection, stability. And right now, he might find that more easily in a dog than a person. Enter Rex. Rex had been AK-9 officer, retired early after sustaining a deep gash along his back during a hostage situation. The department had listed him for euthanasia after the injury left him with a limp and a tendency to become anxious around loud noises, but Dr. Laura Bennett, the town's no-nonsense veterinarian, had intervened. She saw something in Rex, a quiet strength, a kind of calm resolve that went deeper than commands and training. When Sarah arrived at the clinic with Noah bundled in her arms, the boy tucked his chin into his scarf. Eyes wary, Rex stood in the center of the exam room, still as stone, his golden brown eyes locked onto the child's face. He didn't move, didn't wag, just waited. Noah reached out first. It was just a brush of fingertips over fur, but it was enough. Rex lowered his head, letting the boy touch his ears, his snout. Then, without a word, Noah sat down beside the dog, curling his small body into Rex's side. That night, Noah slept without crying. Sarah did too. The days that followed weren't magic, but they were different. Better Noah still didn't speak, but he followed Rex everywhere he fed him, brushed him, even began drawing again in. Every picture there was a large alert. Dog standing beside a small boy. Sometimes there was a van in the background, sometimes a figure in the shadows. Sarah brought the drawings to DR. Bennett, who passed them on to detective. Jack Monroe and his partner Lisa. Grant had been re-examining the Richard Hale case ever since Noah's silent. Testimony had derailed the trial. Hale had no prior convictions, but something about the man never sat right. Monroe trusted instincts the way AK-9 trusted. Then he went to see Dr. Bennett. The same week, Noah drew a red van with a license plate half visible in the snow. YKZ7 close enough to match a partial plate seen near another attempted abduction 2 years earlier, still unsolved. When Monroe met Rex at the vet clinic, he knew immediately this wasn't just a pet. This was a partner Rex served in child abduction response. Laura confirmed he was one of the best until he got hurt, and now he's with Noah. Monroe said slowly, watching the dog nuzzle the boy's hand. Maybe he's still working the case. Back at home, Sarah watched her son and the dog sitting side by side on the living room rug. Noah held a crayon in one hand and was sketching something new, something Monroe would later describe as more than art. It was memory. It was evidence. The silence wasn't empty, it was filled with stories. And Rex remembered every one of them. The snow had not relented since the start of the week. Elkridge lay muffled beneath its heavy coat, a town wrapped in white. Silence. Its streets hushed, its homes glowing faintly through frosted windows. Inside one of those homes, 5-year-old Noah Carter sat curled on the living room rug, a crayon clutched in his small fingers, his brow furrowed in quiet concentration. Rex, the scarred German shepherd who had barely left his side since their first meeting, lay close by, eyes alert and patient, ears twitching at every distant sound. Their bond had grown, wordless but strong, tethered by shared trauma and something deeper, and understanding that required neither explanation nor speech. Since Rex had come into Noah's life, something had shifted. The boy still lived inside a fortress of silence, but the walls were no longer impenetrable. He no longer flinched when the wind knocked loose branches against the roof, or when tires crunched over icy pavement. Outside, the terrors that woke him in the middle of the night no longer ended with sobs muffled in a pillow, but with the warmth of Rex pressing close as steady breathing, grounding Noah like an anchor against the storm. Sarah Carter noticed the changes, subtle but unmistakable. Her son, who had spent days hiding in closets, now sat by the kitchen table with his drawing pad, coloring in scenes that whispered truth. He could not speak. The drawings were never abstract. They told stories. There was always a man, dark looming, his face obscured by shadows, a van with blackened windows, a crooked antenna, a child drawn in bright colors, and Rex fierce and still standing between them. One sketch caught her off guard, a courtroom scene, crude and childlike, but unmistakable. On one side, the dark man hunched behind a table. On the other, the child with his dog. No words, no facial features, just a confrontation of light and shadow. Sarah stared at it for a long time, her throat tightening with the realization of what her son remembered and how clearly. At the rehabilitation center, DR, Laura Bennett had seen hundreds of trauma cases, both human and canine, but this connection, this quiet alchemy between Noah and Rex defied the textbook boundaries. She knew during one afternoon session, she knelt beside Noah with a handful of dog treats and asked if he'd like to help Rex practice a trick. The boy didn't nod, didn't speak, but he reached out, held up a small hand, and then, barely audible above the hum of the heater, he whispered, "Good boy." Laura's breath caught Sarah, watching through the glass window, sank into the nearest chair, tears welling. It was the first word Noah had spoken since the attack. Later, Monroe came by the center, a folder tucked beneath one arm as usual, grim demeanor, softened by. Interest Laura played the security. Footage for him, they watched in silence, as Noah guided Rex through a sequence of commands using only touch and gaze selective mutism isn't a refusal. Laura explained, her voice low. It's a protective freeze, but Rex bypasses that. Noah doesn't need to process language or threat. He simply responds to. Trust Monroe nodded slowly, eyes narrowed. In thought you think Rex recognizes. Something about Hale its possible K9s. Don't forget sense body language energy. They stored if Rex had crossed paths with Hale in his previous deployments. Even briefly he might. Remember Monroe, open his file. I pulled Rex's OK9 records. There was a failed operation 3 years ago, suspected child. Trafficking ring outside Duth. Rex was injured during that raid, and Laura asked. He tapped the sheet, a list of affiliates. One of the names was Richard Hale. Never. Charge was a systems consultant for one of the shell companies tied to the case. It never went to trial. The connection was fragile, circumstantial at best, but it was something. In the days leading up to the reopened, Hiram Monroe worked alongside Assistant DA Jenna Collins to request access to surveillance footage, evidence, logs, anything that could draw a line between Hale and the abandoned case file. They knew what they were chasing might never hold in court, but the moment in the courtroom, Noah's signal, Rex's growl, had been more than symbolic. It had been a spark. That morning the courthouse stood stark against a backdrop of gray skies and snow drifts, a solemn monolith in a world paused by winter. Inside, the gallery buzzed with muted voices. Reporters scribbled in notebooks, jurors whispered, and Judge Sullivan took his seat with a glance toward the child and the dog entering. Together Noah walked beside Rex's, boots squeaking softly on the polished floor. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the sea of eyes watching him. He climbed into the witness chair. Rex sitting like a sentinel at his feet. The prosecutor asked gently, Noah, do you remember who tried to take you that day? There was no response. The boy stared ahead, unmoving. A long moment passed. Then, almost imperceptibly, his hand moved, a small gesture, the same subtle twitch of fingers he had been taught. Rex responded. Instantly, he turned, lifted his head, and let out a deep warning growl. The courtroom froze. Every head turned to Hale. The defendant shifted in his seat, jaw clenched, shoulders tight. For the first time, a flicker of fear crossed his face. Sullivan rapped his gavel once, calling for order. Then he recessed. The court behind closed doors. Monroe handed the old case file to Jenna. The trails. Then he admitted, but this is the first real link we've had. She flipped through the papers, eyes hardening. It's enough to push for a search warrant if we can prove Hale's connection to that cabin. We might find more than just paperwork. The fight had begun in silence, in trauma, in the small hands of a boy too afraid to speak, but now it was moving, growing, unraveling the dark seams of a case, buried in bureaucracy and time. Noah had done more than remember. With Rex beside him, he had pointed to a man and called him what he was, and though his voice had yet to fully return, his truth had finally been heard. The northern woods outside Elkridge stretched for miles, vast and untouched, blanketed by a fresh layer of snow that muffled even the sound of breath. The stillness would have felt peaceful if not for the weight of what Detective Jack Monroe and his team were hoping to uncover beneath it. Every step they took into the timberline was deliberate, guided by the forensic evidence that had led them here. A rare match in soil residue from Richard Hale's van. Alongside Monroe was Officer Lisa Grant and 2 crime scene technicians, their equipment covered in waterproof gear, lenses fogged from the cold. AK-9 handler held Rex's leash tightly, although the dog had not needed guidance once since their arrival. He moved with a purposeful stride, his nose to the ground, tail rigid, eyes alert and haunted by something only he could sense. The cabin they found wasn't marked on any modern map. It stood partially sunken behind a wall of pine trees, its roof sagging from years of neglect. chimney crumbling, the only sign of recent human presence came in the form of two faint tire tracks half swallowed by the snow leading up the side and disappearing behind the shed. No smoke, no light, yet Rex's body stiffened the moment they neared the door. A deep growl vibrated through his chest as he circled the perimeter. He stopped at the back corner, pawing repeatedly at a narrow plank along the foundation. Monroe knelt beside him, brushed away snow, and spotted what looked like a crude handle, disguised in rotting wood with effort. The team pried it loose, revealing a trap door below it, a steep wooden staircase descended into darkness. The smell was immediate, damp, stale air tinged with metal and mildew. They moved slowly, flashlights cutting through the gloom. Every creak of the stairs echoed in the tight space at the bottom. They found a hidden basement, no more than 10 feet across. A small cot stood in one corner, its thin mattress ripped and soiled. The walls were bare except for a row of children's drawings taped unevenly beside a rusted radiator stick. Figures, bright sons, a house with a swing set in the far corner, chained to a metal bolt driven into the concrete, sat a girl. She was gaunt, pale as the snow above her, limbs trembling from cold and fear. Her eyes hollow yet alert, fixed immediately on Rex. Then in a voice from the shoe she whispered, "Doggy." Monroe stepped forward, kneeling carefully. "Emma Sullivan?" he asked. Softly the girl nodded. It had been 6 months since her disappearance. Her family had long feared the worst, and now, somehow impossibly, she had survived. As Emma was freed from the chains, Rex pressed his body close to her. Without hesitation, the girl curled against him instinctively, her frail fingers gripping his fur. Lisa radioed for medical backup, her voice breaking for the first time in years of duty. Monroe held Emma, gently wrapping her in his coat, whispering reassurances as they carried her out of the dark back. In Elkridge, the courtroom filled beyond capacity as news of Emma's rescue spread. The shift in energy was undeniable. Jenna Collins stood before the judge, her voice steady with purpose, as she presented the new evidence. The cabins discovery, Emma's condition, the DNA match from the restraints and the soil trace found in Hale's van. Every piece had fallen into place, but perhaps more powerful than any of it was the presence of Emma herself, pale, fragile, but alive and ready to testify. When she entered the courtroom, escorted by a nurse and flanked by 2 officers, the room fell into absolute silence. She stopped just beside the witness stand, her fingers wrapped around a worn hospital blanket across the room. Richard Hale, visibly appalled, he didn't blink, didn't breathe. Judge Sullivan allowed her testimony to proceed in closed court with a live feed provided to the jury. Her voice wavered, but her words were clear. She described a man with kind eyes who turned cruel. She described being taken in a black van. She described a basement with no light, days spent counting ceiling cracks to keep her mind from slipping. But when she mentioned the night she heard a dog barking outside, the night something changed. Her eyes softened. She looked over at Rex, who sat beside Noah. The boy reached down, hand resting on the dog's neck, as if lending strength from one survivor to another. And then once again Rex let out a low growl, not of aggression, but recognition. His gaze never wavered from Richard Hale. That was when the final thread unraveled. Hale shifted his calm facade, cracking the pressure in the courtroom, built with every heartbeat, every tick of the clock. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering furiously, and then he stood. "Your Honor," he said, voice tight, "I'd like to change my plea." Gasps broke through the tension like shattered glass. Judge Sullivan's gavel struck once, calling for order. He fixed Hale with a stare colder than the wind outside. "Are you pleading guilty, Mr. Hale?" A moment past Hale's eyes flicked toward the children, Emma seated beside the nurse, Noah holding Rex's leash, and finally the monster bowed. Yes, the court erupted. Reporters scribbled notes, furiously news. Cameras outside rolled nonstop, and while the nation would soon know the outcome of the case, what mattered most To those in that room was far more. Intimate the truth had found a way to the surface and the ones who brought it. There had never spoken more than a few. Words, one was a child, the other a dog, who never stopped believing in the ones he was meant to protect as the courtroom emptied Noah, and Rex stepped out into the falling snow. Sarah reached for her son's hand, and this time Noah took it willingly. Beside them, Rex trotted ahead, ears alert, scar glinting faintly beneath the courthouse lights in the cold where once silence had taken root. Warmth had begun to bloom again. The snow clung to Elkridge like memory, thick, unmoving, and cold enough to preserve what had come before. Days after Richard Hale's confession and the courtroom's eruption of justice, the town returned to its usual winter hush. But for those whose lives had brushed up against the shadow of that man, nothing would ever be quite the same. Not for Emma Sullivan, who now slept at home with a nightlight and her parents close by. Not for Sarah Carter, who had learned the shape of her son's silence. And not for Noah, who for the first time since that day in the yard had found a way back to himself. The sentencing came swiftly. Judge Sullivan had no intention of granting leniency, life imprisonment, no parole, no possibility of appeal. The gavel came down like a closing door, but the true resonance of that day came not from the court's decision, but from Noah. The courtroom was filled to capacity. The press lined the walls. Every eye turned toward the small boy with the large dog at his side as they entered the gallery. Noah's shoulders had straightened in recent days, not by much, but enough to show that something inside had shifted. He clutched Rex's leash like a lifeline. The judge invited closing statements, but the room stilled when Noah stood. He didn't approach the bench. He didn't look at the cameras. He simply placed a hand on Rex's back, leaned close, and whispered just loud enough for the room to hear. "Thank you." A few people gasped, some cried. Judge Sullivan offered a quiet nod. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about a moment, the kind that stitched the boy back together, the kind that said without flourish healing was real. In the weeks that followed, the world swirled around them like snow in the storm. News vans camped on Main Street. Feature pieces were written about the silent boy and his dog. Sarah refused most interviews, but one story printed in a Sunday National captured it right. It wasn't just the boy who had been saved. It was the belief that truth still mattered. Noah started speaking more, not often, but more. He whispered to Rex while brushing his coat, read short picture books aloud in halting syllables, and hummed when drawing. His therapist, Yara, Dick called it post-traumatic thaw. Sarah called a miracle. Every word was like spring cracking through the frost. Rex, now officially adopted by the Carters, was no longer just a dog. He was family. His once alert Hirung posture had softened into a guardian's calm. He followed Noah everywhere, even when it wasn't necessary. If the boy played outside, Rex stood sentry near the tree, and if he was sick, Rex lay pressed against the bed frame, unmoving for hours. 3 months after the trial, on a wind-bitten afternoon, Elkridge hosted a modest ceremony outside the town library. A white tent had been pitched, heaters humming beneath, and a new sign unveiled: Noah and Rex Foundation for Healing and Hope. It was Sarah's idea, with help from Detective Monroe and Officer Lisa Grant. The nonprofit would partner trauma-affected children with rescue dogs and K-9 retirees. Laura Bennett volunteered as medical advisor, pledging support from the local clinic. The foundation's mission turned shared pain into connection. At the opening, Monroe spoke briefly. His words were simple: not every hero wears a badge, some walk on 4 legs and never ask for thanks. Then Emma stepped forward. Her father held her hand, but she released it when she reached Rex. He was grayer now, but just as still. She whispered something into his ear. No one else heard it, and kissed his snout. Rex didn't move, just closed his eyes. The audience clapped, but Noah, standing in his puffy jacket beside his mother, didn't look to the crowd. He looked at Emma, then at Rex, and then up into the Sky years past the snow came again, and again winters in Elk Ridge were reliable. That way, but change had happened quiet. And slow Noah turned 8, his voice grew. Stronger the nightmares stopped visiting. As often he laughed more, and Rex he aged. The limp in his hind leg worsened his. Muzzle faded white, but his eyes never. Changed one quiet evening just before. The first heavy snow of the season, Noah sat beneath the large oak tree in their backyard, sketchbook balanced across his lap. The sun was low, the shadows long. Rex lay at his side, tail still, ears relaxed. Noah had drawn a new picture, one of himself holding a leash with a big, scarred dog beside him and stars above. He leaned down, wrapping his arms around. "Rex, you're still my hero," he whispered. Rex huffed softly, leaning into the boys' chest from the kitchen window. Sarah watched. She didn't need to hear what was said. She saw it all in the way her son stood now, the way he loved. She turned off the stove and stepped outside, not to interrupt, just to feel the air beside them, and so beneath a sky filled with frost, a boy who had once forgotten how to speak, and a dog who had never needed words stayed curled beneath the oak tree, quiet, whole, their guardians. We can name, and others we can only feel. In Elk Ridge, when the snow falls heavy, you might still hear the wind whistle through the trees, but if you listen closely, you'll also feel something deeper. A silence kept a promise honored, and the heartbeat of a dog who never left his post.